Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our monthly CRE broker forum through NICAR, the Northern Illinois Commercial Association of Realtors. This is where we have an opportunity to advertise our clients' number one priority, whether it be a listing for our sellers, a buyer, a tenant, a landlord, or if we're just trying to solve a problem. We're coming on here helping each other as brokers, finding ways to help facilitate a deal and have a little bit of competition. And so sometimes we have a presentation at the beginning and then a Q&A. And then afterwards, that's when we'll go through all our needs and wants. But only the presentation will be recorded and put on both the NICAR webpage, the CRE broker forum page, as well as on YouTube. And maybe you might see it on some other social media. So everyone is welcome to attend. We particularly would like to see commercial practitioners and those that are trying to get a deal done for their clients and their company. So I would like to present to you who our presenter is, but feel free in the meantime, you're always welcome to put all your contact information in the chat, and we will save it, download it so that we can follow up with each other afterwards. So please do join us in our future forums. If you have any questions, suggestions, always happy to hear them. I'm Teresa Mueller with Trillium Real Estate, and I'm part of the board on NICAR, having done Commercial Global Business Network and now the CRE Broker Forum. So always open to ideas. So I would like to present our presenter, Jerry Brown. He is a property tax lawyer in the city of Chicago, and he is with Siegel and Callahan. And he is going to talk to us a little bit about helping your clients manage assessment volatility, which I can't imagine that happening here in Chicago at all, and it could apply elsewhere. So feel free to watch this. Reach out to Jerry afterwards if you didn't hear the information here or the question answer. He is with Siegel and Callahan and is on LinkedIn. Not sure if he's on other social media, but he could talk to that. So without further ado, Jerry, it's all you.
Good morning, and thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. I'm Jerry Brown with a firm of Siegel and Callahan. We do property tax appeals. And the issue of assessment volatility, we run into this frequently with people who have just purchased properties for some very interesting reasons. Frequently, people will assume at the closing that you should escrow 110% of the previous year's taxes to cover the tax liability for the year in which the transaction takes place. And we've seen a few people who've come to this after the closing and gotten burned because the money put aside in the escrow wasn't enough to cover the taxes. So there are a number of clients we work with before the transaction to help guide them as to what they should expect in terms of tax liability. Now, in most of Illinois, the assessments don't fluctuate a great deal. And in most of these cases, 110% probably would be enough, unless you are buying in a year in which there is a reassessment of your property. So if there's going to be a reassessment, that should be a red flag that there's a real chance that the assessment is going to increase more than just the 10% reflected in what's typically held over in the escrow. So one, we'll look to see, is this a reassessment year? And if it is a reassessment year, what kind of increase can you expect? So, of course, we'll look at the income and expense data and the cap rate. And many of the assessors around the state will actually talk to you about what kind of increase they are planning. But again, you should not just assume that 110% of the previous year is going to be enough. Also, even if it's not a reassessment year, you want to see what's happened in the previous appeals on the property. Are you getting a really low assessment on one year because the property was vacant or it's being renovated and the property hadn't yet stabilized. So if your seller is escrowing 110% based on an appeal result that was 1 year only based on vacancy, that number is going to shoot up considerably after you take ownership, and then you're going to be left without enough money in the escrow to pay the upcoming taxes, and you'll have to come out, or your clients will have to come out of pocket to cover that. We see many cases where there hasn't been a discussion about what kind of appeals are underway during the transaction. And we've seen one case where there wasn't an agreement as to which side would continue the appeal to either the property tax appeal board or circuit court. So the case ended up getting dismissed. So the buyer ended up having no recourse to continue the appeal, to meet the tax liability that they met. So make sure that your closing attorney is asking these questions. Is there an appeal pending? If so, if there's a plan to appeal it to the property tax appeal board or circuit court, who's going to continue that litigation? Will it be the buyer? Will it be the seller? If there's going to be a refund, who's going to be entitled to that refund? Is it to be split between the parties? But these are important questions to ask. We're working with a client now where they based the tax escrow on an unrealistically low number. The increase at the reassessment increase was dramatic, and they ended up having to pay $1 million in additional taxes. And there had been an appeal filed at the property tax appeal board for that year, but since there had been no agreement as to continuing the appeal was dismissed. So it doesn't take a lot of effort to drill down on these questions, but you do need to make sure your clients are alert to ask them of their closing attorney and make sure that they are protected in terms of having enough money in the escrow to cover their tax liability. Another issue that's emerging this year in Chicago, this is the reassessment year for everything in Chicago. The assessor is taking a different approach to mixed use properties. They've been typically known as Class 318. Normally, a mixed use property, if it has residential units, you would assess the whole building at 10% of its fair market value. For buildings between 20,000 and just under 100,000 square feet, I think if they have 7 units or fewer, the assessor has been reclassifying these buildings by separating the commercial unit and increasing the assessment percentage for that portion of the building from 10% to 25%. So if your client is buying a mixed-use property and getting the taxes escrowed on the belief that the whole building is going to continue to be assessed at 10%, and then it gets reassessed and the commercial unit is separated out and reassessed at 25%, they're going to see a dramatic increase in the tax liability that isn't going to be covered by what's been set aside in the escrow. So this is yet another concern to be wary of. And third, this doesn't happen as often, but it can. Your tax liability is determined by the levies of the taxing districts in which the property is located. Normally, there isn't a huge change from year to year in tax levies, but sometimes there can be. Sometimes one of the taxing districts may have authorized a very large capital improvement project, or as we may remember when Rahm Emanuel was mayor, he actually passed a significant property tax increase to cover unfunded pension liability. So it may be worth asking, is there anything like that that's likely to significantly increase the levies or the tax levies that you're going to be paying. Sometimes it's hard to know that in advance, but sometimes it does happen, and we want to make sure that you're protected in event that it does. So those are the big things that we know of and we frequently consult clients on in terms of how to minimize their tax liability during a transaction. Of course, if you do this before things have closed, you have the opportunity to make changes to make sure that you're covered in case the tax liability turns out to be considerably higher than what was expected. Uh, is there any questions? That pretty much covers what I have.
I do have some questions. So if any of you have a question, just use the reaction key to raise your hand. I would like to know, since you're doing this day in and day out, can you give an example of like a huge win that you've had in appealing the taxes?
We've had several. We work with a number of, we do a very large number of, say, affordable multifamily buildings. So in addition to getting our clients qualified for the new affordable housing incentive program, which at its highest level can reduce the assessment by 35%, we've been very successful appealing, and typically over the last few years based on income and expenses. One reason we've not been using appraisals as much as we have in years past is that sales prices until about a year or a year and a half were so high that it was really hard to find appraisals that would support a reduction. But you can still argue based on income and expenses. So we've had many cases where we were able to achieve a fairly dramatic reductions based on the actual performance of the property and in conjunction with getting the property qualified for the affordable housing incentive program. We've had some cases where we're working with developers who are taking over, long abandoned property and doing an extensive rehab to make it valuable. But when they started the process, the assessor still had it assessed as though it were a fully intact, functioning property. So we've been very successful at showing both the assessor and the board of review that this is a vacant, uninhabitable building. It's been uninhabitable for a very long time. Our client is restoring it to usability. So we've had a number of successes in terms of getting the taxes down to a point where it's still feasible for the client to then complete the rehab, and then once the rehab is done, then and stabilize the property, then the taxes will of course then go up, in line with a fully operating property. But your client doesn't want to be paying the taxes for a fully operating property when they're still in the middle of doing a gut rehab for it. So those are some of the things we've had a great deal of success working on.
Okay. Can you tell me about some resources that might be valuable for all commercial practitioners in assessing what they should do? I mean, obviously you're a great resource, but what are other resources that people can refer to?
If you're doing multifamily, I would look at the website for the Community Investment Corporation, or CIC. They have lots of information, particularly about the Affordable Housing Incentive Program. And I've hosted webinars on how to qualify for the program. Also, the assessor site actually does have a lot of information about some of the various programs that are available, including incentive programs. In addition to the incentives for multifamily properties, there are incentives for rehabbing property or building from scratch and building either commercial or industrial property. Under those incentives in Chicago and Cook County, reduces the assessment percentage from 25% to 10% for a 10-year period, and they are renewable. So, but that information is on the Cook County assessor's website as well.
Mm-hmm. And I believe that you have a program coming up with the lead assessor, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the assessor's office and this the next program that you have coming up?
Sure. I'm on the board of directors for the Southside Builders Association, and in our June 5th lunchtime meeting, our guest is Assessor Fritz Kagi. Uh, we will talk about the ongoing reassessment of all the properties in the Chicago area. Particularly, he's been getting lots of questions about the reclassification of mixed use properties. And also another big concern is what's going on with the downtown properties. How much are they going to be downgraded in terms of value, and how much of an impact that's going to have on other property classes? Thus far, his position has been he's not going to have to downgrade them nearly as much as people fear, and it's not going to have as big an impact as people think. Thus far, the only two townships in Chicago he has released his numbers for are Rogers Park and West Township. And in West Township, which has the western part of the loop, the number that is consistent with what the assessor has said, that he would not be doing dramatic reductions in the proposed assessments. How that'll play out in the appeal process remains to be seen. I've known Assessor Kagi actually since he started campaigning for office. Actually, I met him at a Whole Foods in River Forest. He was wearing a Kenwood Academy sweatshirt, and that prompted my attention because I went to Kenwood Academy and he went there as well, albeit I was class of 81 and he's class of 89. I've had the opportunity to appear on panels with him and interviewed him several times, and I've developed a working relationship with many on his staff, and he does make himself available to answer questions. So we're looking to a pretty wide-ranging discussion with him.
Not that anyone would want, I don't find it exciting to have a political career, but it seems like that would be an especially difficult career path. And I always find it interesting that someone would be willing to do that. Dr. Mustafa, you have a question.
Yes, Jerry, when you have single occupied buildings, how can you help us with that challenge going up against PTAB?
Typically for PTAB, we would be looking for an appraisal to establish the value to make out your case. And there are some cases where we can't bring it to PCAB because we do work with a number of appraisers, and if the available appraisal evidence or prelims tell us that they just can't improve on where the assessor is, that does make it difficult to advance to a case either at the PTAB or with a specific objection case in circuit court. But the best evidence there would be getting an appraisal to establish the value for the property. Thank you.
And Peter, you have a question?
Yeah, Jerry, I think you mentioned the 6B and 7B incentives. If you build a building, does that you have to have 50% occupancy to claim those incentives?
Right. So once you've either done your renovation or your construction, the incentive is not activated until you have achieved substantial occupancy, which means greater than 50%.
Okay, and that is occupancy. At that point, you go back to the board. I mean, has there been any issues with them granting that 7B or 6B?
No, once you can show that you have achieved substantial occupancy, yes, they do grant it. There are, compliance affidavits that you have to file, but you do have to show that you've achieved substantial occupancy and that the property is being used in conformity with the purposes you outlined in the incentive application.
Okay. One more thing about Kagi. A nice man. I've met him. We've talked. But does he understand what's happening with the commercial real estate in the commercial real estate world as far as investment properties in Cook County and in Chicago for that matter, but Cook County mainly? I've gone to investors throughout the nation, and everybody knows about Cook County. They won't touch it. They don't want to go in here. It's hurt our market as far as the real estate taxes are concerned, and everybody in the nation, in the world knows it. I mean, they'd say Cook County, nope, we're not going to do it.
Does he understand that? Yes. How he interprets that, I think there are many people who would disagree with him on certain points. And I've had a number of discussions with him and heard him give remarks on this. And to be fair, this problem does predate Assessor Katie. Chicago has long had a bad reputation in terms of how high our taxes are. The assessor, I believe, does fairly and correctly point out that a large portion of the tax burden goes to funding the public schools, and leaving aside the whole debate as to how much money we're supposed to be getting from the state of Illinois versus putting all of the weight of that expenditure on property taxes, that's a debate that could tie us up for several days. But the fact that that is the primary source for funding education is a huge driver in terms of why the tax burden is as high as it is. When KE ran, he did have the view that historically the larger commercial and multifamily properties had been unfairly underassessed at the expense of homeowners, and he viewed it as necessary to make a substantial correction to kind of rebalance the burden of paying the tax levies. How he has adjusted that burden, many can have differing views. I had a much easier time getting appropriate relief for multifamily project buildings than I did with industrial. Industrial buildings did very well during COVID, but the biggest area I ran into problems with were much older industrial buildings, which, in my judgment and the judgment of many others, they did not appreciate and value as much as the newer industrial facilities. So I think many of their assessment increases, I think, were overly were much higher than appropriate, and the owners of in that property class suffered a great deal. So as I'm seeing the new assessment numbers come out and discussing with my clients how it's going to impact their businesses, yes, it's an ongoing discussion. The assessor, I think he does understand it, but I think he has a certain set of views as to why he should pursue the policies that he does, and we expect to probe into some of those questions when we meet with him again on June 5th.
Since many of us here are in the Chicagoland market, could you provide a ray of sunshine?
Well, from what I've seen thus far, the increases are not as sharp as they were in 2021. Now, keep in mind, I've only seen the numbers for 2 townships. We'll see what this looks like as we get further into the reassessment. And there still remains 2 avenues for appealing at the county level. There's the assessor. There's also the board of review. I know there is some tension between the assessor and the board of review, and that in the eyes of the assessor, when the board gives very large reductions, they're undoing the work of the assessor's office. In the eyes of property tax lawyers like me, when the board does that, they are giving appropriate relief to make sure that business owners can continue to operate. So there's going to continue to be that difference, but reductions are still being granted, and relief is still available, but we perhaps have to work a bit harder to get there in many cases. But there are ample opportunities to address and fight back against overassessed properties.
Thank you, Jerry. How is the best way for anyone to contact you if they need assistance?
I'll put my number in the chat, but my number is 312-629-0222, extension 217. And you can reach me at email at jerry@prptax.com.
And what is the date of your next event with Fritz?
That will be Wednesday, June 5th
Okay.
for the Southside Builders.
Builders. All right. Thank you very much, Jerry, for enlightening us. For anyone listening to this recording, I encourage you to check out all of our NICAR events, whether it be CGBN, CRE Broker Forum, the golf events. We would love to have you and always appreciate feedback. You can reach me, Teresa Mueller, 630-715-9999, or info@teresamueller.com. Always happy to help and help all our brokers work with each other and have a more successful transactional community. Thank you and look forward to hearing from you soon. Ciao for now.